The rain poured relentlessly, a curtain of silver that blurred the edges of the world. The storm had rolled in quickly, transforming the once peaceful streets into rushing torrents of water. Puddles swelled into small lakes, and the roar of the rain drowned out all other sounds. Amid this chaos, a desperate, high-pitched whine cut through the storm, a sound of pure anguish that could shatter even the hardest heart. Near the edge of a flooded canal, a small, frail dog stood trembling. Her thin coat was soaked through, clinging to her emaciated frame, and her swollen belly made her struggle to keep her balance against the rising waters. Her eyes, large and filled with terror, darted around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The canal, once a quiet trickle, had become a churning, deadly force, and the water was rising fast. Each step she took toward the edge seemed more desperate than the last, as if she understood that time was running out not just for herself but for the tiny lives she carried inside her. In the distance, a faint glow pierced through the rain, the headlights of a vehicle moving cautiously down the road. The driver, a young man on his way home, squinted through the downpour, trying to make out shapes in the storm. He hadn't planned to stop, the weather was too dangerous to linger, and the warmth of home beckoned. But then, as the beams of his headlights swept over the flooded canal, he saw her, a small, trembling figure at the water's edge. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. At first, he thought it might be debris caught in the flood. But then the shape moved, stumbling forward on unsteady legs, and he realized it was a dog. Not just any dog, she was heavily pregnant, her swollen belly a clear sign that she was close to giving birth. And now, she was teetering dangerously close to the edge of the canal, her cries barely audible over the storm but filled with a kind of desperation he couldn't ignore. He pulled over, his hands shaking as he turned on his hazard lights. The rain lashed against the windshield as he sat for a moment, heart pounding, debating whether he should step out. The water was rising quickly, and the currents were strong enough to sweep away a grown man. But every instinct in him screamed that he couldn't just drive away. Something about the way the dog moved, the way she kept looking back at the water as if searching for something, struck a chord deep within him. Throwing on his jacket, he stepped out into the storm. The cold rain soaked him instantly, and the wind howled like a living thing, fighting against his every step. As he approached the canal, the dog spotted him. She froze, her body taut with fear, and let out a low, warning growl. Her instincts told her to protect herself, even in her weakened state, but her trembling legs gave away her vulnerability. "It's okay," the man called out, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "I'm not going to hurt you." He crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening, and extended a hand. The dog hesitated, her large, sorrowful eyes locking onto his. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The man could see her fear, her hesitation, but also the faintest glimmer of hope, a desperate, fragile hope that someone might help her. But then, with a sudden burst of energy, the dog turned and plunged into the water. The man's heart lurched as he watched her struggle against the current, her small body no match for the swirling waters. For a moment, he thought she had given up, but then he realized she wasn't swimming aimlessly. She was heading towards something caught against the reeds a few feet away. As she reached it, he saw what it was, a tiny, lifeless puppy, no bigger than the palm of his hand, its body limp and soaked. The dog tried desperately to nudge the puppy with her nose, her cries growing louder, more frantic. It was as if she couldn't accept what had happened, couldn't bear the reality of losing one of her babies. The man felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't know what drove her, whether it was instinct, love, or some unshakable bond, but he knew he couldn't let her fight this battle alone. Without thinking, he waded into the water. The cold was like a shock to his system, and the current tugged at him with alarming strength. But he pressed on, his eyes never leaving the struggling dog. When he reached her, she let out a startled yelp, but he gently scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. Her body was trembling violently, and he could feel the rapid beat of her heart against his arms. "I've got you," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if the words were for her or for himself. With one arm holding the dog, he used his free hand to grab the tiny puppy. Its body was limp and cold, and for a moment he feared the worst. But as he made his way back to the shore, he thought he felt the faintest flicker of movement, a fragile, fluttering sign of life. Back on dry land, he set the dog down gently and laid the puppy on his jacket, shielding it from the rain. The dog immediately curled around it, licking its tiny body with a ferocity born of desperation. The man knelt beside them, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone. He needed help, someone who knew how to care for animals in this state. The first number that came to mind was a nearby animal rescue. He dialed quickly, his voice urgent as he explained the situation. The person on the other end assured him they would send someone immediately, but in the meantime, he needed to keep the dog and her puppy warm and safe. The man glanced around, his mind racing. His car was parked nearby, and though it wasn't ideal, it was the best option he had. Carefully, he scooped up the dog and her puppy, carrying them to the vehicle. The dog let out a soft whimper but didn't resist. It was as if she understood that he was trying to help. Inside the car, he cranked up the heat, creating a cocoon of warmth. The dog settled onto the seat, curling protectively around her puppy, while the man watched anxiously. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. He kept checking the puppy, willing it to move, to make a sound, anything to show it was still alive. Finally, the faintest squeak broke through the silence. The man's breath caught as he saw the puppy twitch, its tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The dog let out a low, relieved whine, licking her baby with renewed vigor. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. When the rescue team arrived, they worked quickly, wrapping the dog and her puppy in warm blankets and checking them over. The man watched, his heart heavy but hopeful. He had done everything he could, but he knew their fate now lay in the hands of professionals. As the rescue team prepared to leave, one of them turned to him, a look of genuine gratitude on their face. "You saved their lives tonight," they said. "Not many people would have stopped in a storm like this." The man shook his head, his eyes lingering on the dog and her puppy as they were loaded into the rescue vehicle. "I couldn't just leave them," he said softly. "She was fighting so hard. I had to help." As the rescue vehicle disappeared into the storm, the man stood in the rain, his clothes still soaked, but his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He didn't know what the future held for the dog and her puppy, but he felt a strange sense of peace, knowing he had been part of their story, a story of survival, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. And yet, as he climbed back into his car and drove away, a single thought lingered in his mind: was it truly a miracle that saved them? Or was it something else, something deeper, something that connected all living beings in moments of need? The storm raged on, but somewhere in the night, hope had taken root. The storm had subsided by morning, leaving behind a landscape soaked and glistening in the pale light of dawn. The streets were quieter now, the hum of the city slowly returning as people emerged from their homes to assess the damage. Branches littered the roads, puddles shimmered like mirrors, and the air carried the damp, earthy scent of rain. For most, it was just another day after a storm, but for the man, the events of the previous night were still fresh in his mind. He hadn't been able to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dog's frightened face, the way she had clung to her puppy with a fierce desperation. He found himself replaying the moment when he thought the puppy wouldn't survive, how his heart had seemed to stop until he saw the tiny chest rise and fall again. It wasn't just an act of chance, he thought. It felt like something bigger, a moment where his presence had truly mattered. But the more he thought about it, the more questions began to creep into his mind. How had the dog ended up there, alone and in such a vulnerable state? She didn't seem like a stray. Despite her thin frame, there had been a certain gentleness about her, as if she were used to human kindness. And where were the rest of her puppies? The thought made his stomach tighten. It didn't seem likely that she'd only had one. Something didn't add up. Later that morning, he decided to call the rescue center to check on her. The woman who answered recognized his voice immediately and reassured him that both the dog and her puppy were safe. They had been cleaned up, fed, and were resting comfortably in the center's care. The puppy, while still weak, had shown signs of improvement, much to everyone's relief. The dog, however, remained restless, often pacing and whining softly, as if she were still searching for something. The woman paused for a moment before continuing. "It's strange, though," she said. "We don't think she's a stray. She's been microchipped." That piece of information caught him off guard. "So, she has an owner?" "We're looking into it," the woman replied. "The chip was registered a few years ago, but the contact information is outdated. We're trying to track them down, but in the meantime, we're keeping a close eye on her. She's been through a lot." After the call ended, the man sat in silence, his mind racing. If she had an owner, why had she been out there in such a dangerous situation? And why hadn't anyone come looking for her? The idea of someone abandoning a pregnant dog felt too cruel to consider, but the alternative that something had happened to separate her from her home was just as troubling. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Against his better judgment, he decided to visit the rescue center. It wasn't far, and he felt a responsibility to see her again, to confirm for himself that she and the puppy were truly okay. The rescue center was a modest building tucked away on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a small, fenced yard where a few dogs were playing. Inside, the air was filled with the sounds of barking and the soft murmurs of volunteers tending to the animals. A staff member greeted him warmly and led him to a quiet room where the dog and her puppy were resting. The sight of them made his chest tighten. The dog was curled up on a soft blanket, her body forming a protective circle around her puppy. Her fur, now clean and dry, had a warm, golden hue, and her eyes, though still wary, seemed calmer. When she saw him, she lifted her head and let out a soft whine, her tail thumping weakly against the floor. It was as if she recognized him, the man who had pulled her from the brink. "She's been doing better," the staff member said. "She's eating well, and the puppy's gaining strength. But she's still very anxious. She keeps pacing near the door, like she's waiting for someone." The man knelt down slowly, extending his hand. The dog hesitated for a moment before inching closer, sniffing his fingers. Her nose was cold and damp, a small reminder of her fragile vitality. When she finally allowed him to pet her, he felt the tension in her body begin to ease, if only slightly. "Do you think she's looking for the rest of her litter?" he asked, his voice low. The staff member nodded. "It's possible. We've seen it before with mothers who've been separated from their puppies. Sometimes they don't settle until they're reunited, if that's even possible. But without more information, it's hard to say." The man's mind churned. The idea of her puppies being out there somewhere, alone and vulnerable, was almost too much to bear. He couldn't let it go, not when there might still be a chance to help. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. The staff member hesitated, then gave him a thoughtful look. "Actually, there might be. We're still working on tracking down her owner, but if you're willing, you could help us piece together what happened. Sometimes, just retracing their steps can lead to answers." It was a long shot, but he agreed without hesitation. The staff provided him with a few details about the area where the dog had been found and explained how they typically handled cases like this. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. That afternoon, he returned to the canal. The storm's aftermath was evident. Debris littered the banks, and the water, though calmer, still carried the muddy remnants of its earlier fury. He walked slowly along the edge, scanning for any signs that might provide a clue. As he moved further down the path, something caught his eye: a small patch of flattened grass near the water's edge. Kneeling down, he noticed faint paw prints leading away from the spot, as if a group of animals had been there recently. His heart quickened. Could this be where she had been before he found her? He followed the trail, which led him to a narrow gap in the bushes. Beyond it, he discovered a sheltered area, partially hidden from view. The ground was littered with bits of torn fabric and leaves, forming what looked like a makeshift nest. His pulse quickened. It was clear that this had been a safe spot, at least for a time. But there was no sign of the other puppies. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Had they been swept away by the flood? Or had someone taken them before the storm hit? The questions gnawed at him, each one more troubling than the last. He snapped a few photos of the area, hoping they might be useful to the rescue center, and then sat back on his heels, staring at the empty nest. The sound of a twig snapping behind him made him turn abruptly. A figure was standing a few feet away, a woman, older, with a weathered face and kind eyes. She held a walking stick and wore a raincoat that looked like it had seen better days. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. He hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I found a dog here last night." She was pregnant. I think this might have been her spot. The woman's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. "The golden one? I saw her a few days ago. Poor thing looked like she'd been through hell." She was with a small litter then. His heart leapt. "You saw the puppies? Do you know where they went?" She shook her head, her brow furrowing. "I didn't see them after that. But there was a man, strange fellow, poking around here yesterday. He didn't look like he belonged. Had a cage with him." I didn't think much of it at the time, but now her words trailed off, leaving a heavy silence between them. The man's hands clenched into fists. The idea of someone taking the puppies, possibly for their own gain, filled him with a quiet rage. He thanked the woman for the information, his mind racing as he returned to his car. If someone had taken the puppies, they needed to be found, and quickly. The drive back to the rescue center was a blur, his thoughts a whirlwind of determination and dread. He relayed everything to the staff, who promised to follow up and alert the authorities if necessary. But as the day wore on, the weight of the mystery only grew heavier. That night, as he lay awake once more, the image of the dog's pleading eyes haunted him. Somewhere out there, her story wasn't finished. And he couldn't shake the feeling that his role in it had only just begun. The following morning, the rescue center buzzed with quiet urgency. The staff had already begun contacting nearby shelters and veterinary clinics to see if anyone had encountered the missing puppies. Or the man described by the woman at the canal. The man, who had barely slept, returned to the center with a coffee in hand and a determined expression. The sight of the dog, now sitting upright and more alert, brought a flicker of hope. She wagged her tail weakly when she saw him, but her eyes carried the same restless worry. The staff shared their findings so far, which were frustratingly limited. A few shelters had received reports of stray puppies in the area, but none matched the description of the golden dog's litter. As for the man with the cage, he seemed to have disappeared without a trace. It was as if the trail had gone cold overnight. The man couldn't sit idle any longer. He asked the staff for permission to take the dog with him, reasoning that she might recognize familiar places or pick up a scent that could lead them to her puppies. They hesitated at first, concerned about the dog's still fragile state, but eventually agreed, provided he was careful and brought her back if she showed any signs of distress. Loading her into his car was easier than he'd expected. She climbed in willingly, as if she understood this was part of the search. Her puppy remained at the rescue center, safe and warm, while they ventured back to the canal. The dog's nose twitched as soon as they arrived, and she began sniffing the air with an urgency that made his heart race. He followed her lead as she pulled him along the muddy path, her tail wagging faintly as they neared the makeshift nest. She stopped there, sniffing the ground intently, her ears swiveling in every direction. She let out a soft whine, circling the area as if expecting her puppies to appear from the shadows. The man crouched beside her, gently scratching behind her ears. "I know you're trying," he murmured. "We'll find them. I promise." They spent hours combing the area, moving further down the canal and into the nearby streets. The dog's energy began to wane as the day wore on, but she pressed forward, occasionally pausing to sniff at a spot or let out a quiet bark. The man's determination matched hers, even as doubts started creeping into his mind. What if they were too late? What if the puppies had been taken far away, beyond their reach? Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city, the dog froze. Her ears perked up, and she let out a sharp bark, pulling at the leash with a sudden burst of strength. The man's heart pounded as he followed her gaze to an alleyway up ahead. It was dimly lit and cluttered with discarded boxes and trash, but there was movement, small, quick movements near the far end. He squinted, straining to see. And then he heard it, the faint, high-pitched whimper of a puppy. Adrenaline surged through him as he and the dog approached cautiously. The whimpering grew louder, joined by a soft, muffled bark. His grip on the leash tightened as they rounded the corner, and there, tucked between two overturned crates, were two tiny puppies. They were huddled together, shivering and frightened, their fur matted with dirt. The dog let out a low, mournful whine, her tail wagging furiously as she nudged them with her nose. The man's relief was immediate but short-lived. As he knelt to examine the puppies, he noticed they weren't alone. A cage sat a few feet away, partially hidden behind a stack of wooden pallets. It was empty now, but the sight of it sent a chill down his spine. Someone had been keeping them here. He quickly scooped up the puppies, cradling them in his arms as the dog hovered protectively. Her eyes darted around nervously, and the man felt a prickling sense of unease, as if they were being watched. He turned sharply, scanning the alley for any sign of movement, but it was eerily quiet. "We need to go," he muttered, his voice low. The dog seemed to understand, staying close to his side as they hurried back to the car. He placed the puppies in a blanket-lined box he'd brought along, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. The feeling of being followed lingered, even as they pulled away from the alley and headed back to the rescue center. When they arrived, the staff was overjoyed to see the puppies. They worked quickly to clean and feed them, noting that while they were weak and frightened, they didn't appear to be seriously injured. The dog, reunited with two of her missing babies, seemed visibly calmer, her body relaxing for the first time in days. She lay beside them, licking their faces gently as if reassuring herself they were real. But the man couldn't shake his unease. He told the staff about the cage in the alley and the feeling of being watched. They listened intently, their expressions growing serious. It was clear now that someone had taken the puppies, but why? And where were the rest of them? One of the staff members suggested they contact the authorities, and the man agreed. It was too dangerous to ignore. Whoever had taken the puppies might still be out there, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't try again. The thought made his stomach churn. As the night wore on, he stayed at the rescue center, unable to leave the dog and her puppies. He watched them sleep, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. The dog opened her eyes occasionally, glancing at him as if to say thank you, before closing them again. But even in the quiet moments, the tension lingered. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing, and the looming question of who had taken the puppies and why hung heavily in the air. The man knew they couldn't rest until all the puppies were safe and the mystery was solved. As he sat in the dimly lit room, his thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise outside, a faint scuffling sound, almost too quiet to notice. He froze, his heart pounding as he strained to listen. The sound came again, this time closer, accompanied by the faint creak of the front gate. His pulse quickened. It wasn't over yet. The man remained frozen in place, his ears straining to catch every sound beyond the door. The faint scuffling outside grew louder, accompanied by the sharp creak of the gate swinging open. His pulse quickened, adrenaline surging through his veins. The rescue center was supposed to be a safe haven, but now, it felt anything but. Quietly, he reached for his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he prepared to call for help. The dog, lying beside her two rescued puppies, lifted her head, her ears twitching. A low growl rumbled in her throat, her body tensing as she stared at the door. The man glanced at her, their shared unease thick in the air. Whatever was happening outside, it wasn't good. The faint sound of footsteps reached his ears. Someone or something was moving cautiously, trying not to be heard. The man's mind raced. It couldn't be a coincidence, not after what they'd found in the alley. Was it the same person who had taken the puppies? Were they here to reclaim what they'd lost, or worse, to silence anyone who might stand in their way? The footsteps paused just outside the door. The man swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the phone. The silence stretched on, oppressive and nerve-wracking, until the handle turned ever so slightly. He jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The noise startled whoever was outside, and the door handle snapped back into place. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steadier than he felt. The only answer was the sound of retreating footsteps, quick and purposeful. He rushed to the door, throwing it open just in time to see a shadowy figure disappearing into the darkness. They were too far away to make out any details, but their hurried retreat confirmed his suspicions they'd been caught in the act. The dog barked sharply behind him, as if urging him to pursue the intruder, but he hesitated. Chasing after them in the dead of night, with no idea who or what he was dealing with, felt reckless. Instead, he stepped back inside and locked the door, his hands shaking as he dialed the police. The officers arrived quickly, their presence a reassuring sight in the otherwise tense atmosphere. The man explained everything about the puppies, the cage in the alley, and now this attempted intrusion. The officers took his statement seriously, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. They promised to increase patrols in the area and advised the rescue center staff to stay vigilant. But even after the police left, the unease lingered. The man couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was behind this wouldn't give up so easily. He stayed awake through the night, keeping watch over the dog and her puppies, his mind racing with questions. Who was this person? Why had they taken the puppies? And what could they possibly want with them? The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, the rescue center's phone rang. A staff member answered, their expression quickly shifting from curious to alarmed. They covered the receiver and gestured for the man to come over. "It's someone claiming to have seen the rest of the puppies," they whispered. "But they're being strange." The man took the phone, his heart pounding. "Hello?" On the other end, a gravelly voice spoke, low and deliberate. "I know where the rest of the puppies are. If you want them back, come to the old warehouse by the docks. Come alone." The line went dead before he could respond. He stared at the phone, a mix of anger and fear twisting in his chest. It was clear now this wasn't just about the puppies. This was a trap, designed to draw him in. But could he really ignore the chance to save the rest of them? The staff urged him to call the police, but he hesitated. What if this person disappeared before the authorities could act? What if the puppies were moved again, to a place where no one could find them? Against his better judgment, he decided to go. He reassured the staff he'd be careful and promised to call for help at the first sign of danger. The drive to the docks felt endless, every bump in the road heightening his anxiety. The old warehouse loomed ahead, its crumbling exterior and broken windows giving it an ominous air. He parked a short distance away, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car. The dog had insisted on coming, her sharp barks and insistent pawing making it clear she wouldn't be left behind. Now, she trotted at his side, her posture alert and protective. As they approached the building, the man noticed something strange. The heavy doors were slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. Inside, the dim light cast long shadows across the empty space, highlighting the abandoned machinery and scattered debris. he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. I'm here. Where are the puppies? For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the far end of the warehouse, a figure stepped into view. It was the same shadowy silhouette he'd seen the night before, but now, they were close enough to make out the details. The man was tall and wiry, his face obscured by a hood. In his hands he held a small bundle of puppy, trembling and whimpering. The man's breath caught in his throat. Why are you doing this? What do you want? The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed the puppy on the ground and stepped back, his movements deliberate. The dog growled low in her throat, her body tensing as she watched him. I wanted to see who cared enough to come, the man said finally, his voice cold and detached. You've proven you do. But let's see how far you're willing to go. Before the man could react, the stranger turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving the puppy behind. The man rushed forward, scooping up the tiny creature and cradling it against his chest. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. A sudden noise, a metallic clang, drew his attention to the far corner of the warehouse. The dog barked furiously, pulling at the leash as the sound grew louder. It was as if something or someone was moving behind the stacks of rusted machinery. The man's heart pounded as he backed toward the exit, clutching the puppy tightly. But before they could make it out, the doors slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as he fumbled for his phone, the faint glow of its screen the only source of light. The dog stayed close, her growls echoing in the oppressive silence. And then, from the darkness, came a voice, a low, mocking laugh that sent a chill down his spine. You've made it this far, the stranger said, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. But the game isn't over yet. The man's grip on the puppy tightened as he searched the shadows, his mind racing. He had walked into the trap willingly, and now, he had no idea how to get out. The stakes had never been higher, and the danger never more real. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, every second stretching into an eternity, as he braced for whatever was about to come next. The man's breath was shallow, his heart thundering in his chest as he clutched the trembling puppy. The dog at his side growled low and steady, her body tense as she scanned the darkened warehouse. The voice echoed again, mocking and taunting, sending a shiver down his spine. He spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to bounce off the walls, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. He took a cautious step forward, his phone's flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. I don't know what you want, he called, his voice shaky but resolute. But I'm not leaving without the rest of the puppies. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then, from the far corner, a faint whimper reached his ears. His heart leapt, and he turned toward the sound, his flashlight illuminating a stack of crates. He moved quickly, the dog staying close, her tail stiff and her ears alert. Behind the crates, he found them 3 tiny, shivering puppies huddled together. Relief and urgency flooded him as he bent down, carefully gathering them into his arms. The dog barked sharply, her warning cutting through his moment of triumph. He turned just in time to see the shadowy figure emerge from the darkness, stepping into the weak beam of light. The man's face was partially obscured, but his expression was cold and calculating. You've made your choice, he said, his tone laced with menace. But nothing comes without a cost. Before the man could react, the stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blinking device. He pressed a button, and a low, ominous hum filled the air. The floor beneath them vibrated slightly, and the crates stacked around the warehouse began to shift. The man realized with dawning horror that the entire structure was rigged. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice desperate. These are just innocent animals. They've done nothing to you. The stranger's gaze flicked to the puppies, his expression unreadable. For a fleeting moment, the man thought he saw a hint of hesitation. But then the stranger straightened, his grip tightening on the device. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "This isn't about them. It's about sending a message." The dog lunged forward, barking ferociously, and the stranger flinched. Seizing the moment, the man darted toward the exit, clutching the puppies tightly. The stranger shouted something unintelligible, but the man didn't stop. He sprinted toward the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the vibrations grew stronger. Behind him, the crates toppled, crashing to the floor in a deafening cacophony. He reached the door and pushed against it with all his strength. For a terrifying second, it didn't budge. But then it gave way, and he stumbled outside into the cold night air. The dog was right behind him, herded by pure instinct to protect. They ran together, the man barely aware of his surroundings as he focused on putting as much distance as possible between them and the warehouse. A sudden explosion rocked the ground, the force of it throwing him off his feet. He hit the pavement hard, shielding the puppies with his body as debris rained down around him. The dog yelped but quickly scrambled to her feet, circling him protectively. For a moment, everything was chaos: the roar of the explosion, the acrid smell of smoke, and the distant wail of approaching sirens. When the dust settled, the man looked back at the warehouse. The building was engulfed in flames, the intense heat radiating outward. He staggered to his feet, clutching the puppies, his mind racing. The stranger was nowhere to be seen, but the man couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As the emergency responders arrived, he handed the puppies over to the rescue staff, his relief tempered by the lingering sense of unease. The dog stayed close, her gaze fixed on the burning warehouse as if expecting the stranger to emerge from the flames. In the following days, the rescue center was flooded with support from the community. Donations poured in, and people came forward to adopt the puppies, eager to give them the loving homes they deserved. The man tried to focus on the positive, but the memory of the stranger's words haunted him. What message had he been trying to send? And why had he targeted the puppies in the first place? One evening, as he was closing up the rescue center, he found a small envelope taped to the door. His stomach sank as he opened it, the neatly folded note inside sending a chill down his spine. "This isn't the end," it read. "You saved them this time, but you can't save them all." The man looked around, his eyes scanning the empty street. There was no sign of anyone, but the eerie feeling of being watched lingered. He knew then that the stranger wasn't finished, that this was just the beginning of something far bigger and more dangerous than he'd realized. The man stood frozen on the empty street, the note clutched tightly in his hand. His mind raced, trying to piece together the meaning behind the stranger's words. He had thought the ordeal was over, but this message brought a stark reminder that the fight was far from finished. Yet, as much as the threat loomed in the back of his mind, the immediate needs of the rescued animals demanded his attention. He couldn't let fear paralyze him, not when there were still lives depending on him. Back at the rescue center, the puppies were settling into their temporary accommodations, their once frightened demeanor gradually giving way to playful curiosity. The mother dog was finally relaxing too, her trust in the man deepening as she watched how gently he cared for her pups. Each wag of her tail, each soft bark, was a small victory, a reminder that kindness and perseverance could still make a difference. In the following weeks, the man worked tirelessly to strengthen the security at the rescue center. With the support of local volunteers and generous donations, new cameras were installed, and a state-of-the-art alarm system was put in place. The small, tight-knit community rallied around him, their collective love for animals creating a powerful bond. Though the shadow of the stranger's threat lingered, it was overshadowed by the light of compassion and solidarity. As the puppies grew, they became the heart of the center, drawing in visitors and inspiring countless adoption applications. Families from all over came to meet them, their laughter filling the once quiet halls. The man made sure each pup went to a home where they would be loved and cared for, conducting thorough interviews and background checks to ensure their safety. Watching them leave, tails wagging and eyes bright with excitement, brought a bittersweet joy. He would miss them, but knowing they were starting new lives made it all worthwhile. Despite the positive changes, the man couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every creak of a door, every shadow cast by the setting sun, seemed to carry a sinister undertone. He found himself glancing over his shoulder more often, scanning the faces of passers-by for a hint of familiarity. But no matter how vigilant he was, the stranger never appeared again. It was as if he had vanished, leaving only the memory of his chilling words behind. One evening, as the man was locking up the center, he heard a soft noise from the alley beside the building. His heart quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. With the flashlight from his phone, he cautiously approached the source of the sound. To his surprise, he found a small cardboard box tucked against the wall. Inside was a single puppy, shivering and whimpering. There was no note, no indication of where it had come from or who had left it there. The man scooped up the tiny creature, his heart aching at its condition. It was underweight, its fur matted and eyes dull with exhaustion. As he carried it inside, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whoever was responsible for leaving this puppy had clearly hoped it would find safety here. And that, more than anything, reminded him why he had chosen this path. Over time, the puppy thrived under his care, growing stronger and more playful with each passing day. The mother dog, who had stayed on as a permanent resident of the center, took the pup under her wing, treating it as one of her own. The sight of them together, tails wagging in unison, brought a smile to the man's face. It was moments like these that made all the struggles worth it. Months passed, and life at the rescue center settled into a new rhythm. The man never received another threatening note, nor did he hear from the stranger again. Whether the man had moved on to other pursuits or decided to abandon his plans altogether remained a mystery. But the man chose not to dwell on it. Instead, he focused on what he could control, providing a safe haven for animals in need and educating others about the importance of kindness and responsibility. The story of the rescued puppies and their brave mother became a local legend, spreading far beyond the borders of their small town. People from neighboring cities and even other states visited the center, eager to meet the man who had risked everything to save them. Some came to adopt, while others simply wanted to offer their support. The outpouring of love and generosity was overwhelming, a testament to the good that could arise even in the face of darkness. As the rescue center flourished, the man found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. It wasn't just about saving animals, it was about creating a ripple effect, inspiring others to take action and make a difference in their own ways. He had started with a single act of compassion, and now it had grown into something far greater than he could have imagined. One crisp autumn morning, as he watched the dogs playing in the yard, he felt a deep sense of peace. The challenges he had faced, the fear and uncertainty, had all led to this moment. The center was more than a shelter, it was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a reason to keep going. The man knelt down as the mother dog trotted over to him, her eyes full of trust and gratitude. He scratched behind her ears, a quiet smile spreading across his face. "We did it," he said softly. "We made it through." The dog licked his hand, her tail wagging as if to say she understood. In that simple, unspoken connection, the man found all the affirmation he needed. The future might hold more challenges, but he knew he wouldn't face them alone. Together, they would continue to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, proving that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the world. And so, life went on at the rescue center, filled with laughter, wagging tails, and the steady hum of hope. The man's story became a source of inspiration, a reminder that courage and compassion could triumph over fear. And while the stranger's shadow might never fully fade, it served as a reminder of the strength it took to stand up against darkness, and the incredible things that could happen when people chose to do what was right.